who's here? And who else does not live in Robley but is an undergraduate? And who's a graduate student? Okay, and who's in none of those categories? Okay, well, thank you all for coming. We're really, really lucky to have Arun Majundar here, and I'm going to introduce Arun in a second, but before I do that, I just want to say a couple of thank yous and give you a bit of context about the series that Arun's talk is the capstone for this quarter. Who has been to a Hard Earth talk before? And who has not? Okay, so half and half maybe. My name is Jeff Ball, and I work at Stanford, and my wife and I are what Stanford calls resident fellows in this dorm, which is called Robley Hall. Does anyone know what Robley means? Anyone speak Spanish? What does Robley mean in Spanish? Oak. Excellent, right? So it's a kind of a tree that grows around California. In fact, you'll see them around here. So we, to make a long story short, have engaged in an effort for the past few years in Robley that we call the Robley Living Laboratory for Sustainability at Stanford. And it's a kind of crazy effort to experiment with living sustainably in what is... Hey, Tim. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good. It's
I love this series.
Kind of a crazy, and he's not even being paid for that, kind of a crazy effort to experiment with sustainability in what is Stanford's largest four-class undergraduate dorm, the one that you're sitting here in. And Arun, we'll come full circle to this in a second, has been one of the strongest supporters of this, Arun and the Freeport Institute, so we owe Arun a debt of gratitude for that. So I won't bore you with that because you didn't you come here to hear me, but there are a number of students in this room who this year have been particularly instrumental in banging their heads against the wall to try to make this happen. And it's actually been quite wonderful this year to see what has happened in the walls of this building as students try to figure out how to live sustainably. And this is something that Arun has told me before when I sat in his office and talked to him about this, in a way that actually makes economic sense. Not in a way that just sort of looks green and romantic, but actually that makes sense in a way that's replicable globally. So that is the goal of what we're about, and part of that is this series of talks. John and Brian, where are you guys? There's Jonathan Roth and Brian Reed. Why don't you stand up for a quick second? So John and Brian are the brains and the brawn behind this series. John for the past 2 years, Brian for this year. So thank you guys both. This is the last series this year. I get to stand up here in the last one of these every quarter and kind of yak for longer than I should, but Brian and Jonathan are the ones who make this happen. And it's incredibly difficult and a kind of real exercise in creativity to conceptualize what the focus is going to be every quarter of these talks, and then to actually get people to come and speak. And Arun is one of the illustrious kind of capstone speakers who comes every quarter, but the focus of these talks is for graduate student speakers every quarter, and they've been really stellar this quarter and will be next year as well. So please sign up, see us after before you leave, and sign up for the mailing list if you're not already on it, and you're more than welcome to come and eat the free food and hear the people. Okay, I'm done with the sales job. Arun Majundar. Arun, really quickly, grew up in India. In 1985, he got his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology, and then he went to Berkeley, where he stayed for the next 20 years, roughly. He got his PhD in 4 years, if I know the bio correctly, at Berkeley, and then he became a faculty member at Berkeley, where he stayed until in 2009 he was plucked by one Stephen Chu, a name you may know, who's at Stanford now, who then was Energy Secretary, to become, among other things, the head of something called the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, ARPA-E, which was modeled on something at the Defense Department called DARPA, which was essentially a skunk works for innovation technology, in that case in defense, in this case in energy. And Arun was there at a very interesting couple of years, which is when we were in this country engaged in something called the stimulus package. There's a lot of money being thrown out by the Department of Energy, by the federal government, at innovative energy projects, and Arun was involved in an aspect of that, a really important aspect of that. Then Arun came back to California and went to Google, where he was vice president of energy for Google for a couple of years, and then Stanford got him. And I'm about done, but Arun has many fancy titles at Stanford, but he's essentially Mr. Energy at Stanford. He is, among other things, co-director of the Freeport Institute for Energy, which if you don't know, you should get to know and go on the website of. I will tell you, when I first got to Stanford and had no idea of kind of the universe of different energy things here, the Precourt webpage is the best way to figure out what's going on at Stanford in terms of energy if you're interested. And Arun's involved in a number of things, including something that's near and dear to his heart called the Bits and Watts initiative, which has to do with big data and energy, which he may say something to you about. But the last thing I want to tell you about Arun is that he has lots on his plate, and I know I'm not lying when I tell you that he's happy to be here. Because he really, really, really enjoys engaging with students, particularly with undergraduates. So I give you Arun Majundar. Thanks very much.
All right, so first of all, thank you for the long introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I really like engaging with students. I've been teaching undergraduates every year that I'm here. And I joined in 2014. And the first thing I did in the first quarter was teach a freshman seminar course, and just to get to know the freshmen. And I've been teaching all the undergraduates in mechanical engineering. So what I'm going to talk about energy will affect all of you. And energy cannot be isolated in any economy. It has implications on the economy. I mean, you take energy away and our economy kind of comes to a standstill, or it goes to kind of pre-industrial age, which we're not going backwards. So it definitely affects the economy. It affects national security, because if you don't have access to energy, the economy goes, and there have been wars in the past that have been fought because of access to energy. Okay. And the third is the environment. And the environment in the past has been local air pollution, which is still existing in many parts of the world. Thankfully, we have clean air out here because of the right policies and technologies, but many parts of the world, it's killing people. But now, more so, there is the issue of carbon. And that issue is only getting aggravated. It's not going away. If we want it to go away, we can have all the wishful thinking, but it is really hard. But it's going to affect everyone. So I'm going to give you some numbers for you to remember. And the way to remember is the way I like to do is as simple as possible. And I usually, when I go around to other universities, I give a pop quiz to students. So here's my pop quiz. I'm going to give you some numbers, and I want you to think about it and tell me what they mean. And there's no grading for this, so don't worry. You can make mistakes. It's okay. So the first number is 1. Okay. Now, let me give you the answer to that. It's 1 degree Celsius. This is the global average temperature rise since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's about 1.2, but 1 is a whole number. Okay? So it's 1 degree Celsius. And this is the global average temperature rise, which is technically accurate. But in reality, while we energy geeks and climate geeks talk about 1.2 degrees Celsius and, well, it's 1.1, 1.2, for the most average people, that 1 degree temperature rise doesn't mean much. Because if I go on the streets of San Jose and it's 1 degree Celsius, I said, okay, every day there's a temperature fluctuation of a few degrees. But what we fail to say is that the 1 degree temperature rise creates extreme weather conditions where we find the distribution of energy going towards the hotter side, and we are finding the extreme weather condition with its flooding or with its heat waves happening much more often, 5 times more often than what we used to have before. Okay? And the extremes of weather conditions have a disproportionate effect on our lives, on our economy, on our agriculture, on our livestock, etc. So it really affects us. And so when we talk about 1 degree Celsius, it is not the 1 that matters, it is the extreme that they create that matters. And we are seeing the effects of that right now. If you go to the Midwest, it's been flooded, excessive. We've heard about Houston, You're looking at the heat waves out here and the droughts. So these are conditions that I think in many parts of the world there will be mass migration of people when sub-Saharan Africa becomes more and more arid. You'll find people leaving because they can't grow any food. They have to go somewhere. So we are seeing this effect on humanity, and that's just at 1 degree. Okay, so that's the first number. The second number is 2. That's 2 degrees Celsius. So this was the Paris Agreement, 2 degrees Celsius, and we felt that if 1 is so bad, 2 can be really bad. So we should keep it below 2, right? And it's an arbitrary number. And so the next number is 800. It's not 800 degrees Celsius. But the 800 is the following, that if you want to keep the global average temperature rise below 2, and thereby the extremes of that under constraint, we have a budget left globally of 800 billion tons of CO2 that we can emit. If we cross that limit, we're going to cross 2 degrees, for sure. Okay? So 800 billion tons. Okay? Now just to give you an idea of how much that is, if you add the weight of all the people in the world, all the people, 7.5 billion people, it's 1 billion ton. Okay? So it's a large number, 800 billion tons. That's the third number, 800. The fourth number is 40. And that is the 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide that we emit per year. Okay? So the weight of all the people in the world is 1 billion ton. We are emitting 40 billion tons per year. And the last number is 20. It means if we keep that emission flat, we have 20 years left. And that emission rate is going up, so it's actually less than 20 years. And after that, the emissions have to be 0 if you want to keep it below 2. So the point I'm making is that there's an immense urgency to this matter because we are going to cross 2, most likely, the way it's going. Which means we have to reduce our emission, that's what is called the mitigation. But we are looking at scenarios, and this is where it's going to affect you, all, the next generation, the next several generations, that we are looking at a scenario of 3.5, frankly. Which means we'll have to adapt to those conditions. Humanity has to adapt to those conditions. And it's going to affect first, the most affected people will be the people in low-income level, low-income economies, low-income communities. I mean, I can't even think about the sea level rise effect on, for example, Bangladesh, which is essentially a foot above above sea level, and there are several hundred million people living there. Okay, so that's the bad news. Okay, that is, we are at a level of urgency that we have to reduce emissions, and we have to adapt to different ways of adaptation to climate-related issues. The mitigation part is reducing emissions. How do we do that? And of course, we're very excited about wind and solar and electric vehicles. And in this ecosystem of Silicon Valley and the bubble chamber that we live in, EVs and all are great things. That is just the tip of the iceberg. Why? Because if you were to do emissions reduction, 14% of the emissions, global emissions, come from transportation. Only 14%. Okay? But 30% come from electricity, a lot from coal, of that electricity. In many parts of the world, we rely on coal. Okay? And people are trying to decarbonize, get off coal. And wind and solar, frankly, are cheaper than that. That's about 25-30%. We think about transportation, only 14%. Agriculture and food, 24%. Okay? Which is why the topic today I thought we'd talk about food and agriculture because we don't talk enough about it. That's why the title is Down to Earth. So what can we do? So let me give you some numbers, and I know there are no charts, but this is only from my own failing memory to give you some numbers. Let me talk about what can be done. Let me talk about food wastage. Anywhere in the world, go across the world, about 30 to 40% of the food is wasted. Okay? If you're in an OECD or developed economy, like out here, the food, 30 to 40% of the food is wasted at the consumption end. Okay? And all of that wastage goes to CO2. Okay? Because they're degraded. And that carbon that is there is eaten by bugs and they produce CO2. 30 to 40%. If you go to developing economies, the 30 to 40% of the food is not at the consumption side. Whatever is delivered is eaten. It's between the farmer and the consumer. Because the supply chain are not refrigerated like we have out here. So they get wasted. Okay, vegetables and fruits get wasted, especially in a tropical region when it's hot. They get wasted. 30 to 40%. And there, the price, the amount of your income that you spend on food is much more significant than we do out here. Much more significant. Okay, a lot of the income goes into eating. Out here, it's actually not that much, frankly. And there, the food is being wasted. So if you can reduce the waste in those parts of the world, it actually affects the economic buying power of people. Okay? So, food wastage is a huge, how big is it? So this is what I wanted the number. If you were to use food wastage as a country, okay, the total CO2 emissions from food wastage as a country, as a nation, it would rank after China, United States, estimated, and then food wastage. It's that big. We are wasting, emitting about almost 4 billion tons of CO2. You know, out of the 40 billion tons that we emit, 10% of that is coming from just food wastage. Just for your reference. Okay, so that's one thing. Then, let me say a little bit about our diet. Now this is very personal, of course, and I take this with a pinch of salt in the diet. So, I have the chart out here on the kilograms of CO2 per the kilogram of food consumed, different categories. And I'm going to throw you some numbers. What do you think is the largest net emitter of CO2 in terms of food? Anyone? Yep.
Beef.
Which one?
Beef.
Beef. Beef is not the largest in terms of kilograms of CO2 per kilograms consumed. Do you know which one it is? Anyone? You're close. Yes?
Lamb.
Lamb. Okay. Now lamb is about almost 40 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram consumed. Beef is number 2, by the way. It's about 27. Okay. What does that mean? 40? Well, if you drive your car for about 100 miles, okay, an average car, if you drive for 100 miles, you emit 42 kilograms of CO2. So eating a kilogram of lamb or beef, lamb, let's say, is almost driving a car for 100 miles. Okay? And that has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with grazing. It needs grass. It has to do with how we process. In the case of cow, it has to do with methane emissions, mostly burping. Okay? All, if you put that whole thing together, you know, it's bad. Now, on the other hand, on the other end, the lowest, like 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram consumed, 1-to-1, lentils. Lentils, fruit, milk, vegetables, beans and tofu, and nuts. They're the low end. High end, lamb, beef, cheese, pork, turkey, chicken, tuna, eggs. Potatoes in between. So, what that suggests, and by the way, even though lamb is the highest, beef is consumed more. So the total emission per beef, you're in fact right, because the total emissions, the beef is higher. Okay? So, our diet has a huge influence. And if you look at the total number on kilograms of CO2 per person, and if you multiply by the population, we're talking about several billion tons of CO2 that we're emitting because of our diet. Okay? Now, this is a very, as I said, my wife is a vegetarian. I tried to be a vegetarian. I just could not after a while. So I eat meat, mostly vegetables, but once in a while I do eat meat. I just can't help it. The most important, and this is where innovation comes in, the most important innovation that has happened over the last few years, anyone knows in food?
Impossible burger.
Impossible Burger. You know why Impossible Burger is such a good thing? Why has it picked up so much? There were veggie burgers before.
It tastes like meat.
Why?
Texture.
Texture.
Because
Okay.
it is meat.
What was that?
Because it is meat.
It's not meat. No, it is vegetables.
Oh,
Because
really?
it has.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. See, this is great. The Impossible Burger has confused you.
It,
It-
looks like beef.
I think
I
it's
don't-
the texture.
It looks like, but there are veggie burgers that look like.
Leads.
Yeah. Anyone else?
It tastes like the texture, but I don't know how.
Tastes like the texture. The most important innovation that has happened is that they were able to synthetically make a molecule called heme, which is part of hemoglobin. And it's an organic molecule with an atom of iron in it. And that is there in our blood. That's what we say, something tastes like blood, that's the heme that we're tasting. So they had to create artificial blood, basically, that they inserted in this, which is why we actually like it. Now it feels like a real burger. And the texture and all, yes, it's important, but that was missing before. And now it is picked up like crazy. This is a big deal, because if you can now shift to vegetable-based, meat-like tasting burger, that's a big deal, okay, in terms of carbon emissions. Now, we don't always think about that, because we have been programmed to think about wind and solar and all, which is nothing wrong with that. But boy, this is huge. Last week I was at a conference, a venture capital group. And this venture capital group has a very eclectic group of people, Bill Gates being the primary guy, and he has brought a bunch of billionaires and he created a venture fund to invest in companies that can have the potential to have 0.5 gigaton per year effect, positive effect. Okay? Because our venture capital colleagues in Samuel Road have essentially withdrawn from energy and climate related things because the gains are long term, they want to make quick money, so they invest in Instagram, Snapchat, nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't solve the energy climate problem, which is, I believe, the defining challenge of this century. Okay. So, what they have invested in fact, I was at this conference where they were presenting all the investors conference where all the new companies were presented. And what we're seeing in hemoglobin and Impossible Burger is just the start. There's so much room for innovation out here to make it taste and feel so much more. They are hacking into our tongue, okay, and our taste. And we are going to see chemistry and biology being used to make food that it's going to taste like chicken and beef, say. Okay? And this is a very important, so, the bad news is there's good news as well. People will use their imagination to figure out how to address this problem. Okay? And of course, initially the cost of an Impossible Burger is more than your normal burger, but that cost will come down. And from what I understand, Burger King is now going to serve, right? Impossible Burger, which is great. Now it's going in the supply chain of Burger King and McDonald's, and boy, that's big. There's something good that'll come out of this, of Burger King and McDonald's. So our diet is a big deal. Food wastage, huge problem. Loss of forest for grazing, for meat, huge deal. Methane emissions from cows burping, big deal. So now there's innovation going on in trying to curate the food that these cows will eat so that methane emissions go down. And that's actually a good thing, because that carbon that is going out of methane can go into milk production. Okay? Because that's loss of carbon. At the end of the day, if you do a carbon budget, anything you lose in emissions, whether it's methane or CO2, methane, by the way, is anywhere from 80 to 30 times worse than CO2 in terms of greenhouse gases, global warming potential. So reducing methane is not only good for the environment, it's good for productivity. Okay? So that's on the diet and food side. But let me give you another angle on this, which is, I think, often missed. I mentioned about the fact that we emit about 40 billion tons of CO2 per year, okay, from our industrial system, transportation, electricity, food and agriculture, all our economy. Net production is 40 billion tons of CO2. I'm going to give you a quick math and then pivot to something. 40 billion tons of CO2 is roughly about 10 billion tons of carbon, okay, because CO2 to carbon is at roughly about 3.74 ratio, right? So 40 billion tons of CO2 is about 10 billion tons of carbon, because the oxygen is, I'm going to drop in. Okay? Why am I saying this for? So we are emitting about 10 billion tons of carbon per year. This goes into the atmosphere. What is often lost in this process, we think that all 10 billion tons of carbon remains in the atmosphere. Well, that's not true. If you look at photosynthesis, you know how much we absorb on the earth by photosynthesis per year? Anyone has any idea? Is 120 billion tons of carbon per year. Okay? 120 billion tons of carbon per year compared to 10 billion tons we emit. But the 100 billion tons that we absorb by photosynthesis, 118 goes back. Okay? Why? Because part of it is just the respiration process, which is about half of the 120. 60 goes by respiration. Another 58 or so goes by, the leaves falling on the ground, degradation, and then that decomposing goes back. And about 2 billion tons of carbon remain in the soil. Okay? Now, that's a huge driving force, 120 billion tons of circulation. So that was in balance before we started emitting from our industrial use. The amount of CO2 uptake in the oceans, anyone has a number? Because CO2 can dissolve in water, right? Yeah, aerated drinks. And we have 90 billion tons of carbon being absorbed in the ocean, and about 88 or so go back. And one of the challenges about warming oceans is that we're going to emit more CO2 out. Why? Because as you know, if you take a chilled beer or Diet Coke or a Coke, and if you warm it up, the CO2 comes out. Right? So if you heat it, the oceans heat up, the CO2 will come out. So it's a big deal. So you have 120 billion tons coming, only about 2 or 3 billion tons remaining, and everything goes back, and 90 billion coming, and about 2 billion tons remaining in the ocean, and everything goes back. So this, the natural carbon cycle was essentially in balance till we started emitting this 10 billion tons of carbon from fossil fuel use. Okay. Now we are asking the question, what can we do to figure out how to tweak this in a way that reduces the atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's at the end of the day. It's not the emission, but what is there in the atmosphere. So the good news is that photosynthesis absorbs 120 billion tons of carbon per year. Part of that is agriculture. Because when we grow, corn, when we grow, bananas, or for that matter, rice in many parts of the world, the carbon in that comes from the atmosphere. So we are sequestering CO2, carbon from the atmosphere, and turning that into food. And part of it goes into the roots. The food we consume, but some of the roots remain there. So the big opportunity for R&D, which is what we are, in terms of innovation, is how can we tweak this 120 billion tons of CO2 that is circulating, only 2 billion remain, if you can just add a few more. That will reduce the atmospheric carbon dioxide. So there's a huge amount of interest in this. There's a lot of research going on. We can do the research in the lab to demonstrate. That's absolutely necessary, but not sufficient. It has to be at scale, at the billion-ton scale. But the good news is that we have natural systems that allow you to do that. And the question we are all asking ourselves, can we leverage, can we harness that to do things that we want to do for the planet? Let me stop here, and I just wanted to give you an idea of both the challenges for agriculture and food that we face because of our diet, because of our wasting, and also the opportunities that we have of using agriculture to do something positive about the planet. Let me stop here and we will have a conversation. I suspect the conversation will go in many different directions. Yes?
I'm very fascinated by the idea of Impossible Burger, and it's really tasty. So that's the burger that we'll get at the tab on campus. But the thing is that it's the most expensive burger on the menu as well. So in your opinion, what's the barriers of scaling this process, and also how is it going to impact the livelihood of farmers who use cows as a livelihood?
Right. Great question.
Because for Impossible Burger, it's if it has IPs, then I'm assuming that the people who develop this would gain the most versus farmers who who would not benefit from having their livelihood deprived. Or that makes sense.
So, first of all, anything that is new generally starts off more expensive. I mean, look at a cell phone. Actually, cell phone's going the other way around. It's not a great example. But look at a Tesla car. Start off with a fancy sports car. Now the cost is coming down. Take your television, flat television. That cost is coming down. So the more you do, the better you become. The more higher yield you have in production, the better the supply chain, more efficient the supply chain, and the cost generally comes down. And I think that's what we're likely to see in this Impossible Burger kind of thing. Now, will it hit will it cross the boundary where you actually gets cheaper than normal food? We don't know that yet. And if it does, then it's an economic, imperative to eat that burger as opposed to the meat-based burger, right? So we don't know whether it's going to cross or not, but I won't count out innovation in this process of bringing the cost down. Now, what will happen to the farmers and the people who basically have cows, right? It's a very important social question, because there's nothing wrong with the farmers, right? It's like when we had coal. Coal is bad for the environment, but nothing wrong with the people who are in the coal industry. The people are fine. It's just that coal is being displaced because of economics. So I think this could lead to some significant social dislocation in the agriculture business if this happens and scales to the point that is now displacing meat. And this is not just the United States, this is global. Meat is a global industry. Okay. So yes, there is an issue with that. The biggest consumption, by the way, the biggest growth, the biggest consumption per capita is the United States for meat. Okay. It's about 120 kilograms per year per person. That's a lot. It's a lot. The biggest growth rate are in economies that are growing fast, like China and India. Okay. Because as they become more and more wealthy, they want proteins from meat. And so that's the biggest growth rate. And frankly, while we should be looking at a plant-based diet, frankly, which is good for health, cholesterol is not as bad a problem. You guys don't have to worry about cholesterol. I have to. But the other opportunity is the emerging economy, if they don't go towards that direction and stays within the realm of vegetable-based meat-like products, I think that would be a huge, huge deal. It's a two-pronged issue. Yep.
Me?
Yep, yep.
At the beginning of your talk, you talked about the connection between energy security and national security. So to me, that seems like the military is an important partner. But now, at least in the polarized era, it seems like all the concern about environmental issues is on the left versus most of the military powers on the right. So I was wondering if you had any experience in dealing with that from your time in government.
So when I was in the Department of Energy, my closest partners were in the Department of Defense. We were really literally across the Potomac. I could see the Pentagon and they could see me. And we used to get together every Friday evening for a drink and really to discuss what we're going to do. So the Department of Defense is one of the most aware organizations in terms of energy and climate change. Okay? Because they know it is a military issue. And it could lead to instabilities around the world that they'll have to deal with. And as someone who wants to do the right thing, they are trying to decarbonize more than many organizations that I know. So I think military is hugely in favor of trying to go into a low carbon economy. By the way, they are the biggest users. They are the biggest single user of energy in the United States, is the military. So they have a big role to play in this, and they understand that. So I would say it's best to have military on your side in addressing this problem. Because they, as we all know, one of the big reasons we have been in the Middle East is because of energy, right? That's looking backwards in the 20th century. And so they have to face the brunt of this in the front lines, literally. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yep.
So I'm all for you and totally concur that like photosynthetic sequestration of carbon is probably like our single, like currently most available and scalable tool here in this combat against carbonization of the atmosphere. Agriculture is one of the largest consumers of water
Yes.
generally across the board. And as you start to use and do more agriculture, in fact, you'd be hard pressed to find a farmer that's truly using all of their land already just due to the limited supply of groundwater. And if we try to increase the amount of agriculture to try to combat climate change, how would you address the water shortage? And how would you address that in such a way that didn't involve treating more water and pumping more water and using energy to then treat the water to do the agriculture thing and then kind of just perpetuate this cycle?
It's a great question. So water is going to be one of the most important issues. Certainly in California we feel that, but in other parts of the world, for example, let's take a fast-growing economy like India. India is a groundwater nation, and that is depleting so fast that the city of New Delhi is actually going down because you're removing water, right? Big deal. So I'm completely with you that if you are to go into a agricultural economy where you are growing plant-based food and you're consuming more water, then we have another problem. So I'm a big fan of what Israel has done in drip irrigation. Okay, where you target your irrigation in such a way that you use, I don't know what the factor is, huge amount of less water than what you would use in just
Sprinklers.
spraying. Exactly. Now that initially may cost a little bit, but when you are in a place like Israel where you don't have much water, they had to invent things to do these kinds of things. So I think we have to be absolutely conscious of how much water. Actually, not just water, fertilizer. So fertilizer, by the way, if you know about nitrogen fertilizer, they consume 2% of the world's energy to produce the fertilizer. So one of the other innovations that I saw in this venture capital meeting was bugs that produce nitrogen in the soil.
Also more or
New
less like
bugs.
the world supply of phosphorus.
What's that?
Also more or less like the world supply of phosphorus.
Phosphorus, that's right.
So
Yeah.
that's a limiting factor in.
Good. Yep.
As some of us are close to graduating, what do you think, if we wanted to have careers that could impact this problem, what do you think are the industries or companies that could either work at or start a company in that would have the biggest change?
Start a company, there are plenty. I mean, having just come back from a investment meeting, or you could look at electricity sector, you could look at the, just to give you an idea, the electricity sector is going through an existential crisis. Not just PG&E, which went bankrupt because they couldn't assess the risk. It's just that the idea of serving a ratepayer and without knowing who a customer is and the service, I can go into details of that. This is going to transform because the current model of electric utility, it's untenable long term. That's just the electricity industry. Transportation industry, this is tectonic shift going on from when GM and Volkswagen were saying that they're going to be all electric in the future. Okay, after 100 years of being gasoline-based cars. Okay, think about not only electrification companies, charging infrastructure, services, or the generation of materials that go into. There are so many opportunities. Whenever there's a big transition like that, there's opportunity. Okay. You think about food and agriculture, they'll have to. I mean, it has to be part of the solution. Talk about steel and concrete, which are one of the biggest emitters of CO2. We're not talking about can we somehow decarbonize. Can we make steel some other way? Or do we really need steel? Or concrete, can you make concrete to be more with stones as opposed to cement? Because concrete is basically, cement is the binder with the rocks, right? If you use less cement, that's good because the CO2 emissions go down. That's mechanics of materials now. So there are many opportunities out here. The question is how big is it? I mean, how good is the market to adopt it? What are the financing, early stage, mid stage, late stage? Who are the ones who will adopt it, etc. So there are lots of market-related things. I'm seeing now, it's a very positive sign, the oil and gas companies. They have a good balance sheet, lots of reserve cash. They are getting huge amount of shareholder pressure to decarbonize. And so now each of them, in their own way, have formed different groups internally to figure out whether to innovate, invent the technologies internally, low carbon or zero carbon, or carbon negative internally, or acquire companies, or partner with their former competitors to do something new. That's going on as we speak, and this is only going to increase. So now, I call it a billion-ton scale problem. Remember I said that this is a billion-ton scale problem. And you need billion-ton scale solutions. If you ask the question, how many industries are there today at billion-ton scale? There are only 5. Oil, gas, coal, cement, steel, agriculture. Okay, how many more? times than 6 in Canada. But that's it. You can count them on your fingers. So inventing things that they cannot invent and enabling them to actually decarbonize or scaling yourself, that's a huge, huge opportunity. And this is, I would say, a transition time from going from the 20th century industry to the 21st century industry. Lots of opportunities. Someone else in the hand up. Yep.
So you mentioned how with agriculture, carbon gets stored not just in the plants but also in the soil. But one of the concerns with modern agriculture is that with tilling and monoculture, the soil is rendered less capable of storing carbon. So do you think like increasing our amount of agriculture would even further accelerate that issue, or are there some ideas that you have to kind of?
Great point. So we're probably looking into this. There's something called no-till agriculture. Tilling, when you actually take mechanized, tractors to dig up the soil, to mix it up, that's one of the big sources of CO2. And the question is, can we make the right kind of seeds that we can do agriculture without tilling, so that you keep the carbon in the soil, otherwise you lose the carbon. And yes, there's R&D going on. I mean, this requires R&D to be able to develop those kinds of seeds that will grow without tilling. That's a great point. Well, this is a knowledgeable audience out here. Yes?
How do you see the U.S. government's ability and role in reacting to climate change?
U.S. government. So, interesting. U.S. government is not one thing. There's the House, the Senate, there's the White House, the executive branch, and then there's judiciary, right? Leave alone judiciary for the time being, because there will be lawsuits in the future, okay, on climate-related things. Absolutely there will be, I can assure you that. The lawyers will get involved. How many lawyers are out here? No JDs? No one? Okay, you will have a job, believe me, because there will be lawsuits along these lines of what is fair, what is not fair, and whether there's amendment needed, or does the law tell you this or that. Because there's money involved in this, trillions of dollars involved. Okay, so right now, my perception is I've been on 2 hearings this year, one in the House, one in the Senate. Senate is Republican-led. The Senate hearing was on energy innovation to address climate change, led by Republicans. Okay. So I think, and the general consensus was that there is climate change, number one. It is human-made, okay, problem. Okay, that's a big deal, by the way, for everyone to accept that. There's an urgency to this. We have to address it urgently. And the question is, what do we do? And the debate now is, what do we do? That's a good debate to have, because it's not entirely clear. There's no one path to it. There are multiple paths. So that's where the Senate is. Now, are all the Republicans of the Senate 100% on board? No. We will never expect 100% to be on board. But the fact that the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee is holding a hearing like that is a big deal. Okay? So the Senate is on board. The House is led by the Democrats now. It could flip, who knows. But even the Republicans in the House want to do something. One of the best things that has happened is the Green New Deal, by the way. Now, you may not agree with the details. I don't agree with all the details of the Green New Deal. But what it has done, it has brought the subject up for debate. Because the Republicans say, oh, that's not the right way. So people ask, what is the right way then? What is your plan? And so they have to come up with a plan. That's a good thing. It has forced the dialogue and the discourse. So I think on the Congress side, there is general consensus and agreement that we got to do something. The debate will be, what do we do? What I'm finding right now, and it's not surprising, is that the White House is completely orthogonal to this. And that's where the real issue is. If you see a flip in the White House in 2020, next year, I think we'll have some level of energy and climate legislation by 2023, 2024. It will still require some debate and all that, but we'll see that. If the White House doesn't flip, frankly, I don't think it'll happen until 2024. Okay. I mean, you had Biden's climate plan come out today. I don't know if you guys saw it, right? Mentions ARPA-C, ARPA climate, which I think is perfect because for adaptation, you need someone to look at innovations for climate-related things. It's also highlighted ARPA-E, which is fantastic. I'm not surprised. So, you know, you had Biden, you had O'Rourke Beto come up with his own climate plan. There are different numbers, of course, but I think the consensus is that this will be in the presidential debate in 2020, believe it or not. Okay, because in the past presidential elections, it was not on the table. This one will be. It will be there. Yep.
Whenever we look at technologies to fight climate change, I get confused about how to assess each technology. So if we see coal is bad because electricity from coal is bad because a lot of carbon is emitted, so let's go to wind energy. But then wind and solar is too expensive as of now. So let's say we'll do more growing of agriculture, but then someone pointed out, oh, that will take more water and Delhi will sink or something. So is there a single currency with which we can assess?
First of all, let me correct you. Wind and solar are cheaper than coal today.
Okay.
Pretty much anywhere in the world.
All right.
Okay? I mean, you take the United States, coal is being displaced because of economic reasons, not because of policy. Okay? You take India, which is a big coal nation, coal-fired power plants will be stranded assets soon. $60 billion stranded because wind and solar are cheaper. Same thing in China. So these are the big three coal, nations in the world, and they have their wind and solar is going to displace coal. Now, it won't 100% displace, and so how you manage that coal assets to be low carbon is an issue. Okay, but it's not correct that wind and solar are more expensive. That's 10 years back data. Okay. What was the other question?
Is there a single currency? With
There is no single currency. Anything you do will have consequences. Okay? Anything you do. The question is, can you manage those consequences? Okay? And can you try to optimize it? I mean, you mentioned about water. There will be water consequence. Okay? If you get cheap energy, there will be more energy used. Okay? So that's just the general economics of things. So there'll always be consequences. I mean, the ideal thing would be to have less people, frankly. Okay?
Really?
Yeah. I
Is
mean,
respiration.
the less people
Okay.
in the world will have less carbon emissions because it's really but we can't do much about it, right? It's right now the world population is 7.5. It's going to saturate at about 10 billion people, and that number, there's a big uncertainty. The number depends on the fertility of women in Africa. That's what it depends on. And population control, if you try to force it, it doesn't work. The only way to do it is by education. Okay, especially education of women. So that, if you can't manage that, there will be people, if you use something, there will be consequences. The question is, can we manage it in some ways so that it doesn't harm in a gross way? But if someone says that there will be no consequence of this, don't believe it. Because we are dealing at a geo scale, all of these things. Okay, you had a question, and I'll come back to you.
I think one of the things that, I don't know, I've been grappling with, I guess, in a couple of the classes that I'm in with friends is the question of how to kind of reconcile our perception of the relationship between the natural, man and nature and the natural world. And I wonder what you think the impact of a lot of these technologies and innovations is going to have on that relationship. Do you think it will actually, that we'll get back to more of, I argue an indigenous way of viewing the natural world, or the connections between them, or do you think it will actually act to distance us further by likening us to having the power of nature in some way?
Great question. My sense, this is my perception, is that it'll be very difficult to go backwards in time and go back to a pre-industrial economy. I just don't think that's going to happen. The question we have in front of us is the following. In the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, the economy was all based on growth, economic growth, GDP growth, right? And you have a one-way economy. You have natural resources, we consume, you have implications, impact of that. Okay. That one-way flow of resources, okay, to have negative impact on what it produces, whether it's CO2 or something else, that paradigm has to be changed. We have to get into a much more circular economy, okay, where the waste becomes the food for something else. That's how nature works. I mean, the reason why do we all eat chicken and plants and all that? Because of the DNA and the nucleic acids and the amino acids that are there. Because we cut them up and we put them all together, that's us. We are what we eat, right? So that's the best circular economy you can get. That kind of an economy, broadly speaking, at the trillion-dollar scale, does not exist today. And I think this whole idea of pinning everything to GDP growth rate and to hell with everything else, that has to change. Okay? And we have to come up with better metrics, whether it's Human Development Index or some other way to measure quality of life, to bring the circular economy and value it in some way. We need economists to be able to do that the right way. It was the economists who came up with GDP. And the economists that came up with GDP at the Depression warned of using GDP too much because it doesn't capture other aspects of life. It only captures the value that you. So those are the kinds of things that we have to develop. How to develop economies based on a circular, that GDP is not the only thing, but there are other aspects of it. We'll have to figure this out. You all have to figure this out.
I want to do a quick time check. Thank you. I don't want to end this right now because I see more hands, and this is exactly the intent of this. So if Arun's willing to stick around for a few more minutes, and you'd like to stick around for a few more minutes, you're absolutely welcome to, but I also want to respect your time, so you will not be deemed rude if you came here for an hour and have to get to something else. So if that's the case and you want to go, feel free to go, but we'll keep going for a few more minutes. Great. That was not intended to stop the questions. I have a question.
Okay.
I want to throw at you a question that I've been asked by people in this dorm, and I think hopefully it ties together a couple of things that you've said. So you've done, I think, a wonderful job of giving us a sense from the commanding heights about what the challenges are and the need for things to be material in terms of their solution, and also kind of bringing us to the ground level about how investment in different industries are changing. So the question that I've heard in this dorm by people who are incredibly interested in this topic, some of whom are in this room, is, what the hell do I do? What do I do in a way that actually makes a difference, that's just not going to sort of make me feel good, but what do I do? And secondly, is there really any hope? Are we so far gone that this is just sort of so much rearranging chairs, or can we actually pull a rabbit out of a hat here?
I'm optimistic because I'll tell you why. I mean, let's put this. I'm schizophrenic. Sometimes I'm optimistic. Sometimes I do get depressed by what I see. I'm optimistic because at the end of the day, it's all of this energy, and it's all about the people. And I think there needs to be a global understanding amongst the people that if they don't all contribute to something, we're all going to get screwed. Okay, so I think that's it. We need to come, and this is where leadership really matters. Boy, this leadership matters. And so we need global citizens to talk about this. That this matters to people and what they eat, how they live, what do they do, what preferences they have, will at the end of the day matter. So I'm very actually hopeful that there will be, when the time comes, when it's really bad, someone is going to step up and say that this can't be the way of the 21st century. I mean, just to give you an idea how we live, I mean, we are in a dorm out here. We have talked about this before, that, you know, we can be much more energy efficient than, without sacrificing services, the warmth and the, you know, cooling and heating, etc., as opposed to what we have done in the past. So I think we can be much more energy efficient, which will allow the carbon-free sources to catch up. Because just to give you an idea, United States, the emissions from between 2017 and 2018 went up 3.4% in the United States, which is amazing because we have been installing all wind and solar, and yet the emissions went up. Why? Because the demand went up so much higher that the solar and wind could not keep up. And so we had to use natural gas. And so the emissions went up. So imagine if you had somehow curtailed the demand by becoming more efficient. A, it costs us less, and B, it reduces emissions. So those are kind of things that at the end of the day, it's about people, about the choices we make. So I think that I'm hopeful that people will at some point realize that this is a global thing. I mean, I don't know, how many seen the movie Independence Day? Right? There's the big, you know, extraterrestrial, you know, attack on the world, right? And everyone stood up together. And of course, the President of the United States was right up front. He was flying the plane, right? So, we don't expect that. But that we have in the humanity, not the planet. The planet will survive, do very well. But humanity will be displaced, or humanity will be affected by it. Our food, agriculture, living will be, people will die. So I think at some point, I'm hopeful that that'll happen. I don't know, sooner than later, hopefully. But we haven't had a global set of leaders to say, enough is enough. But we have had that before.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Wind and solar have been described as not being able to sort of shift production in response to fluctuations in demand over the day, whereas you can, you know, burn more coal or burn more natural gas when more people turn on the lights or something. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, this is a whole. Anita, you want to talk about it? Anita is
We have
managing.
another hour or two.
We have an initiative called Bits and Watts just to look at that when you have fluctuating supply side, like you know. So the grid was always designed for that. If you turn on the switch out here, the generator is going to turn on somewhere, right? And so the load was the masters, and the generators were the slaves, right? The master-slave relation. Now it's flipped. So the generators are the master of solar and wind. And why can't the loads go up and down? Why can't you have a little bit of storage? And so there are many ways of addressing that when you have fluctuating generating. And frankly, the way California manages it is the following. We have about 30% solar and wind, mostly solar. So when the solar goes up and down, we have natural gas turbines like a jet engine. You know, when the solar goes down, this thing ramps up, and when the solar goes up, this thing ramps down. Right. So that's how we are managing it. But it need not be natural gas plants in the future. It could be storage or a combination thereof. It could be demand coming down. So the coordination of all of these resources requires information. That's why the name Bits and Watts is the use of the digital technology to manage the grid. Yes?
So one concern of mine, especially as far as wind is concerned, as a renewable resource, is we are pulling energy out of the wind in the form of kinetic energy, but the wind is largely responsible for transporting moisture in the atmosphere across the country, away from the oceans and things like that. And it seems to me like generally I would agree that wind and other renewable resources are better for the environment than coal emitting resources, but we haven't done a huge number of studies regarding the potential for climate change due to the removal of the kinetic energy in the wind and the lack of humidity and moisture transportation across more arid parts of the country and what that might produce climate-wise. And so I'm wondering if you know of any research that's being done on potential climate change, like detriment due to things like renewable resources like wind or PV.
Jane, do you know of any work that has been done?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few people doing it, certainly in the solar area as well. They're looking at albedo changes in that. So that's kind of in the area of climate sciences, what the climate scientists doing those kind of assessments. I don't know of anyone yet that has done a world assessment or looking at if we deploy, the amount of wind that we assume we could deploy in the US, for example, what effects would that have on wind and moisture, or that. I don't know of any studies like that, but if you look into it, you'll probably find a handful of studies that are looking at different parts of the world and looking at the solar and the albedo changes. Maybe some are doing lots of wind studies in Denmark and European countries, so you might find something from universities over there as well.
I think the impact on wind is not so high.
Yeah.
The turbines. It's pretty low. I think that's the.
Right, yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, I think it
tend
would
to
take
agree.
a lot, but it's not a new point. I think it is something that needs to be looked at, especially in combination with the other technologies, and what we're doing. But just.
The energy comes from somewhere.
Yeah,
It's largely
it does.
responsible for some process ecologically that we may not be
Yeah.
terribly savvy to.
Yeah, and it's good to think about those things, because with the tides as well, we think about that. But sometimes, it does depend also, I guess, on the scale of the resource versus what we are taking out of it. And so, that's
Yeah.
something for looking at.
One more question, and then we're going to tie it up. Anyone have one last, the best question that hasn't been asked?
Yep.
A lot of pressure.
Do you see a kind of mass reforestation occurring?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, I hope so.
Can we all,
I certainly hope
can we
so.
all promise that this is a goal for the future?
The way Brazil is going is just the opposite way with a new leader out there.
It's devastating.
What's that?
It's devastating.
It's devastating. Amazon is the lungs of the earth. Okay, and if that gets cleaned up, boy, the impact of that is just so bad. And I really hope this. So you talked about how will it change? As talked about leadership. This is where we need leadership to say that, look, this is the right thing to do. And this is for our own sake. It's not for the planet's sake, it's for our humanity's sake that we got to do this. And in an economic sense, that has to be valued so that people get credit for it financially. So all of those things need to happen. The challenge is that this can all happen. The challenge is the timing. If we don't do enough of this in the next decade or decade and a half, we are looking at a much worse problem to solve than what we have today. And it's the timing issue that was bothered. That's what gets me depressed. It's not that we cannot do in the 21st century. We can. It's got to do it now. Yep.
Sorry, it's just, then if it's about a timing thing, what's the biggest bottleneck and what's stopping the government from declaring it like a global crisis or something that we have to act upon now? Because you said it's about the urgency of acting upon
We
it.
should be talking about climate crisis.
Yeah.
You go to someone who is climate change. Climate change is not enough of a title to get, okay, climate change, fine, I'm changing too, right? Okay, so what? If you don't talk, this communication is so important. If you don't talk about a climate crisis, we're not going to see action. So I think how we communicate to people who, they're busy with changing kids' diapers and, cooking and this, that's normal life. unless you tell them that this is a crisis, no one's going to pay attention. And so I think we have to get out of our technical kind of soapbox and get real with people, or what people understand and appreciate. Yep.
Do you think by for example changing the way that we talk about or the language surrounding climate change, you will like actually imbue people with a sense of like agency or optimism, or do you think it has the potential to do the opposite? Because one of my big things is like, for me it seems like there needs to be, like we've been talking about, there needs to be like a big cultural shift in like the way that we see ourselves, and that obviously takes a lot of time, and that takes talking about it in the media, like representing it in lots of different ways. But the problem is that the power, there are only very few companies and organizations that have the power, like you said, to enact this change as quickly as it has to be done. And so it's like, how do you force, or like how do you, if you don't have the cultural, like if you don't have the like push from the people, how do you get the companies?
In the age of social media,
Yeah.
you ask this question?
Yeah,
Come on.
yeah,
We could get this going. I mean, look, clearly the one way to do this top down, right? Some leadership happens, and that's not what I meant by leadership. Okay, that's one way to say that, okay, the governments come together, we got to do something about it. And that's certainly important. We find in Denmark, or was it Sweden, this girl who decided not to go to class and kind of said that I'm going to do something with climate change. Sweden, right? And now there's a whole group of people in multiple cities in Europe who said, we got to do something with climate change. This is a teaching moment and an opportunity to actually do something, to change. And when this moment comes, we have to be ready. Okay, what do we do now? Well, how about changing our food habits? How about changing, not to sacrifice meat, but changing over to something else? How about asking for, making sure that we use agriculture the right way without compromising on water? So we have to be ready for moments like this, and I think this is the time where we can be ready. And when the moment comes, when people are going to, and especially the next generation is going to say, enough is enough. They're going to ask, what do we do? And there, if you have goofy solutions, it'll never fly. It has to be practically relevant, economically viable, and affordable solutions.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay.
I just want to say two things to those of you particularly who are students, whether you're undergraduates or graduate students. Thank you again, Arun. It was really fabulous. I want to give you an email address if this was interesting and you're thinking about other topics you'd like to be able to come in this room and hear people talk about. It's pretty easy. You don't even have to write it down. It's Roble, R-O-B-L-E, Roble Sustainability at stanford.edu. So just send a note and someone will see it. The second is that essentially everything that Arun talked about this evening has a group of people on this campus trying to tackle. And that group of people uses graduate students, absolutely, but I think it's probably safe to say that that group of people would entertain a discussion about how to use undergraduate students. So if you are half as concerned about these issues as you seemed in this room to be, then you have a responsibility to do more than just sit in here and ask good questions. And that is to get up off your rear end and do something about it. And you're at about the best place in the world to try to do that, so go do it. Thanks. Thank you. That was great. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, the fact that no one wanted to leave after 50 minutes is, yeah. I hope there's And you got, I mean, it was quite well.
It is, yeah.
Oh, the email. I mean, I think that's free, because I think it would be easier to, I wouldn't mind writing on this. Yeah, I wouldn't mind writing it on this book. But I wonder if we can just, I wonder how we're going to get together. Actually, yeah, okay, do you want to do it together? I'm not free tomorrow or tonight. Like Tuesday, maybe. Tuesday and Thursday will really work for me because I'm going to Jane now. We have a final project for another class. Wait,
I've taken a lot of notes. So it's like 500 words.
oh, amazing.
So, and I think that you asked some questions about agriculture.
Yeah, I'm a,
Go ahead.
what the thing is, I like to just be so good with like doing stuff.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just fucking so like not hit and like
So what day is it?
So now they're across the
That's good.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So this is only for Robley students?
It's sent out to everyone. I mean, it's sort of experimenting with what the right time is. Sometimes during the day or in the evening. The problem is that there's just so much going on this campus. Yeah. I'm at some point I want to send you a try to make.
Okay.
But,
Yeah.
yeah. You want to stick around? Sure. Okay, great.
Hi, I just want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Keith. You actually introduced because I teach US energy and climate cooperation with students
It's kind of at least how I see it. We have
during the summer quarter.
Okay.
But anyway, that's my private sector part. A little bit of what I'm here with research. But I teach a course on U.S. Latin American diplomatic relations on Palo Alto campus, but during the summer.
that's like fun. Yeah. You can also just do it like on Thursday and half hour.
Just take one.
Yeah. Yes, there are lots of similarities in Thank you.
Hey, hi, I'm Alicia. It's nice to meet you. I really enjoyed that talk. In the spirit of like getting up off my house. I was just wondering, is there anyone that are you interested in like being open to like talking more with undergraduates or that kind of
You're
stuff?
an undergraduate?
Yeah, I'm an undergraduate.
Which
I'm Earth Systems.
Earth Systems,
Yeah.
okay.
And
You're
I don't know.
sophomore, junior?
I'm sophomore. I'm rising. And I don't know, I just like, I feel like maybe haven't taken enough advantage of this place so far. And like I would love to like learn more.
Okay.
Just really like this stuff, so if there is anyone
Which dorm
like
are you in?
email, I'm in Manga actually.
Okay,
I have
pretty
housing. Yeah, because I was in illness.